Hey there, it's Simon Hurley from Inklips, and I'm here at Scrapbook.com, ready to share how your paper that you choose affects the mediums that you add to it. So whether you're stamping or you're coloring in your stamped images, it really depends and matters what paper you choose so that you can complete your project and make it look awesome. Some of my favorite white cardstocks to use are Neenah 110-pound cardstock, and Scrapbook.com offers this in a couple different sizes. So you have the flat card fronts, and these are just 4 1/4 by 5.5 sheets of cardstock. These are really awesome to add to your card, maybe cut them down and create some card panels. And then you also have the card bases. These are scored right in half, so this makes a side folding card, and all the work is taken out, so all you have to do is just crease it right there and you have your card pre-made for you. Then they have the large sheets of cardstock, and this is an 8.5 by 11 Neenah 80-pound cardstock. So this is really great to create cards with and work with for coloring and things like that. It works really awesome for alcohol markers and stamping down on as well. Now also, I like to use the Distress watercolor cardstock. This comes in a small or larger size. This is card base size, so it's 4 1/4 by 5.5. So it really takes all the guesswork out for you. The nice part about it is that it has a textured side. So it's got little bumps in it, just like watercolor paper would. The cardstock will take those mediums really nicely and work really awesome on this cardstock. So if you're stamping, you probably want to work on the smooth side. And if you're just doing some watercoloring or backgrounds, you probably can work on the more textured side to get that really awesome watercolor. Now there are also some other options for the watercolor cardstock. Like I said, the Distress watercolor cardstock also comes in an 8.5 by 11 size, which is really nice if you want to cut this down or make card bases. This is great as well. And there's also a larger Strathmore watercolor pad. This is really nice if you want to do larger works of art or maybe do a scrapbook page like this with a watercolor background. So this will be really awesome for larger projects like that. And also there's this Prima watercolor paper pad as well. So these are all really awesome options to create cards with and cut them down, or create larger projects if you're looking to do that as well. And they'll all take your watercolor mediums really awesome. So I'm going to start off by comparing how different inks react by being stamped on these cardstocks. And it really does matter what cardstock you're using when you are stamping. So I'm going to start off with the Scrapbook.com hybrid inks. I'm using Cardinal Red here. I'm just going to ink up my stamp. And then I'll stamp it down onto the Neenah cardstock. One important thing about this is that it's super smooth. So it'll take the ink really nicely and give you a great crisp impression. And the ink will kind of slowly sink into here and even smooth out more as you wait. Now I'm going to stamp also down onto the watercolor cardstock using the same ink. So I'll make sure my stamp is nice and inked. And then I'm going to stamp it down onto the watercolor cardstock. Now I'm using the textured side of the watercolor cardstock, and you can see that there's a lot of texture in there because it didn't stamp perfectly down. It's not a super smooth cardstock. So you don't really want to do stamping on top of this cardstock unless if you're using the smooth side of the cardstock, and still there is a little more texture in that. So you want to be careful for that. And also there's little tiny splotches in here. It doesn't take the ink as nicely as just a regular smooth Neenah cardstock would, as this is really great for stamping. And now I'm going to stamp Distress Oxide down onto both of these sheets as well, so we can give that a good comparison too. So I'm going to stamp this down onto Neenah. And the Distress Oxides give a really nice, smooth stamped image. You see that stamps really nicely down onto that Neenah cardstock. Then I'll go down onto the watercolor cardstock as well. And I'll stamp that down. Now both of these gave a pretty nice impression. You can see that the Distress Oxide kind of sunk into the Neenah cardstock right away. And you can still see a little bit of shine on the ink right on top of the watercolor cardstock. So it hasn't completely sunk into the surface yet. Now I'm going to go in over top of both of these, and I'm going to get some water flowing through my water brush. And on the watercolor cardstock, you'll see that when I go over top of the Distress Oxide, I can kind of fade and blend that ink out with my water brush. So that still really nicely reacts with the water when I'm using the watercolor cardstock. You can see there that I've kind of pulled it out there, which is really awesome. I'm going to clean off my brush a little bit, and I'll go into the hybrid ink. You can see it's not moving, which is a good sign. That hybrid ink stays in place and it'll be permanent with water. So it didn't really move at all on that watercolor cardstock, which is really great. And next, I'm going to do the same thing to the Neenah cardstock. I'll kind of take out some of that Distress Oxide. I'm doing the same thing that I did on the watercolor cardstock. And here's where the mediums that you use really matter. So you can see on the Neenah cardstock, the Distress Oxide didn't move as much. It still did move and kind of bleed a little bit, But since that ink sinks into the surface a little bit more, the watercolor cardstock allows a little bit more time to be able to move and play with the inks, whereas the Neenah, it kind of sinks right into the cardstock right away. So with both of these, you'll want to use the watercolor cardstock if you're working with a water medium. I'm going to do the same thing on the Neenah cardstock, and that hybrid ink doesn't move. So that Scrapbook.com hybrid ink is going to stay really nice and put on all of your mediums, which is really great when you're using that ink and you want it to be nice and waterproof. So now I'm going to share how to use markers on your watercolor cardstock to get a similar effect, and you'll see how both of them kind of react on both of these cardstocks as well. I'm going to start off with a Nuvo Aquaflow marker. This is a real brush kind of marker, so it looks almost like a paintbrush there. I'm going to go right onto the Neenah cardstock. Let's start off by just adding some color down there. And then I'll bring in my water brush here, and I'm just going to kind of water this out. You can see as I'm adding water down, barely any of that water moves, and it doesn't really move the color at all. It kind of almost started ripping the paper too. So when you're using your Neenah cardstock as well, you want to make sure you're not really using water mediums with it, as it's not going to really move or blend, and it's not going to give you time to really pull out that color. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'll apply some of that Aquaflow onto the watercolor cardstock. You can see it sits on the surface a little bit longer. That's a good sign. I'm going to take my water brush now, and I'll just add some water to this and water out my medium. And look how much of a difference you get with that. You really are able to pull out that medium a lot more and really create that awesome watercolor effect on the watercolor cardstock. So this gives a super awesome effect with markers like this. Now I'm going to share also using the distress marker. This is a little bit different. It's got a felt tip on it. We'll go into the Neenah cardstock, and you can see the color basically sinks right into the surface there. And again, I'll take my water brush, and it barely moves. That's what you're going to get on the Neenah cardstock, and that's not bad. This is just a great cardstock for stamping. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'll bring my distress marker to the watercolor cardstock. You can see it sits on the surface a little bit longer and allows you a little bit more time to move around the color and create that watercolor effect. So again, those mediums work really well on this watercolor cardstock when you're using water. Now I'm also going to quickly go into the Ganzai Tambi watercolors and just quickly show you how it's going to work from a pan. Now if I'm using the watercolor straight from a palette, and I'm going to go onto the Neenah cardstock, it doesn't actually give you too bad of a result. It'll kind of almost rip the cardstock a little bit if you work it too much, but you're able to still get a little bit of blending there. Now when you try to go back in and add water, you're going to get a little bit of a problem. You're not going to be able to really blend that out, but you can apply watercolor and still get a cool look on the Neenah cardstock. You just can't really move that around after it's already set into the cardstock. Now I'm going to go back into that Ganzai Tambi watercolor palette, and I'll do the same thing onto the watercolor cardstock. And you can see almost an immediate difference. You can see on this one, you do have a lot of time to move around and add lots of water to this and still blend out all the colors, even if it is kind of set into that cardstock. You can see that color on there, and you get a really awesome watercolor look. Like I said, you can still get that similar look if you're going straight from a palette with the Neenah cardstock, but you just can't work it as much. Okay, so I'm going to do kind of a watercolor look on my card. So I'm going to use the Distress Watercolor cardstock, and I'm going to use it on the smooth side here. I'm going to do a technique that's called Emboss Resist, and this is where your kind of embossing powder design is going to resist your watercolor that you're adding down to the surface, which is really awesome. So I'm going to start by taking my anti-static powder tool, and I'm just going to add down a lot of powder to the surface here. When you're using a powder tool like this, you want to kind of shake it to get some of that powder out, and then use your brush to add powder all over the surface there. This is going to take any static away from the surface and make sure that your embossing powder doesn't stick where you don't want it. So I'll bring in my Hero Arts background stamp here. This one is a really fun kind of Christmas with poinsettias and things like that. And then I'm going to bring in my embossing powder here, and I'll grab my Versamark ink, and I'm going to ink up this whole stamp here. I like to ink my background stamps face up like this, and then I'll take my cardstock with the smooth side down onto the background stamp. Just add pressure all over your paper so you can get that whole image stamped down onto the watercolor cardstock. Like I said, there's a little bit of texture even on the smooth side, so you want to make sure to give it lots of pressure to make sure that that whole stamped image has transferred over. So once I'm done with that, I'm going to grab a piece of cardstock, and then I'm grabbing the Hero Arts Gold embossing powder, and I'm going to just sprinkle this right over top of my background here. And I'll tap off the excess. And then I'll flip it over and do the same thing to the other side here. Since we used that powder tool at the beginning, there's no embossing powder where we don't want it to. Then I'm going to grab my heat tool and I'm going to start heating this background until it turns a nice shiny gold color. So you want to move your heat tool until that embossing powder starts to kind of change to that shiny gold color. And right when it does, you're going to want to keep your heat tool moving onto the next section of the embossing powder. Making sure you keep the heat tool moving and not overheat the certain areas is really important, because you don't want to overheat it, because then it kind of sinks into the cardstock and gets rid of that shiny gold effect that you want. So after I'm done heat embossing, I'm going to take all the extra powder and I'll take it and funnel it right back into the jar with the piece of paper. And then we can use this embossing powder over and over again. So a little bit lasts a long time with this stuff. So I'm just going to go into the Ganze Tambi colors here, and I'm going to go right onto the piece here. And since we're on that watercolor cardstock, you can see that it really holds that water nicely and really allows you to kind of blend your color together and add a little bit of shading in there too. So I can go in with some different colors and keep adding different colors of red into that poinsettia. And then I'll add little color inside of some of these berries. Now the nice part about having this emboss resisted background here is that even though it looks like I'm covering some of this embossing powder because I added lots of color down there, I can really easily take a little bit of a paper towel and remove some of that color that's on the surface, and it reveals that embossing powder again. So it kind of gives that plastic coating on top of here, and none of your watercolor will stick to that. So I'll go in with some brown color, and I'll color in some of these pine cones. So when creating watercolor backgrounds, I've heat set this to dry it. You could really go in and be super detailed, but I kind of went outside the lines a little bit, and I love to do that on fun backgrounds like this that look a little bit sketched out. I think it really adds a little bit of character and color to the background all over, but you could definitely stay inside the lines and give it really awesome coloring. So once I'm done here, you see that gold embossing still, and that's the really cool part about the resist heat embossing, is that all that gold will stay shiny, and it's not like black lines where it might disappear underneath your watercolor. So it stays really nice and shiny for that background. Now to adhere this onto a card, it's a little bit warped since there's lots of water on it that I added with the watercolor. And so one thing that I find to be really helpful is taking a roll of adhesive. This one is from Scrapbook.com, and this adhesive is super strong. So compared to a tape runner, this is going to hold it down really nicely, especially if it's a little bit warped like watercolor paper. So I'm going to take this large 6-inch roll of the Scrapbook.com adhesive. And I love this stuff. I use it on lots of projects, but especially to adhere pieces like this down. So I'm going to use these large Tim Holtz scissors. These are non-stick, so it's going to cut through this stuff really easily because it is super sticky. And then I'm going to take it and I'll just kind of line it up with the bottom edge there. And then I'm going to just take my scissors right around those edges and make sure that that adhesive is cut off there. So adding that double-sided adhesive on the back here makes sure that even though I'm sending that watercolor piece through the mail, it's not going to come apart on my recipient because this is super strong and can adhere to your card. So I'll peel off the backing here, and then I can add it right down onto my card. So to do this, I just like to start in the top right corner. Then I'll make sure it lines up with the top edge of my card. Then I can slowly adhere it down onto the card. So to finish off this card, I added this Merry Christmas sentiment. This is from a Scrapbook.com set called Sentiments for Every Occasion. So it's got lots of different sentiments you can pair together, like Merry Christmas, happy wishes, sending happy wishes, and you got lots of different holidays here. So you got Thanksgiving, Christmas, Mother's Day, New Year's Eve, graduation, Easter. There's lots of different things you can celebrate with this set and use it all year round. So it's a great staple for sentiments. So I embossed the Christmas sentiment and used that Merry with just black ink on white cardstock. And you can see the different kinds of backgrounds here with that gold embossing and that nice resist effect that you get with that. I also like to use the Neenah cardstock for my coloring as well. So I'm going to be using this Critter Concert stamp set from Lawn Fun, which is so adorable with all of these fun little animals. I'm going to share how to color one of them in on the Neenah cardstock with alcohol markers. So I'm using the Scrapbook.com black hybrid ink here. since it's both alcohol marker and watercolor friendly. And then I'm going to stamp it right down onto my surface. So I'm using the tonic alcohol markers. These come in packs of 3 that blend really nicely together. So I'm going to grab some of the colors that I chose and do my blending. Now when you're doing alcohol marker coloring, you want to start off with the color that has the lowest number on it and then go to the higher number. And it'll also have little labels on here, and you can go from what looks to be the lightest to the darkest color. So I like to start off with the lightest color, and I'm going to go in here and just color the little owl in and lay down kind of a base of color. Then I'll go in with the mid-tone. I'm going to just add some quick shading. I just kind of add my shadows wherever. You can add them kind of where lines meet or where you want the owl to have a little bit of depth. Then I'm going to go into my last darkest color here, and I'll add it right up against the edge. And then you can go back through. I'll just go right to the lightest color here, and I can blend all of these colors together. And you can get a really nice blend. And you can keep going back and forth too to get a really nice blend. So if you want to, you can go back to that darker color and add some more of that in. And then go to the mid-tone too, so you can kind of play around with blending the colors together. Sometimes it takes a couple layers of color to get a really nice blend with markers. But this Neenah cardstock takes these alcohol markers really well and allows you to really color in your image nicely. So then I'll go into a lighter brown color, and I'm just going to color the inside portion of the owl here, and then go to the violin and color that in. Not adding too much shading to these portions either, since they're kind of smaller. So to finish off this card, I'm going to create a little background behind this little owl here. I'm going to be using the Ball Gone Blue from Scrapbook.com and one of these jumbo daubers to do my blending. So you can put 2 fingers inside these daubers and they cover a really great large surface area too. So I'm going to be using this Altenew die. I already cut it out of a piece of cardstock and kind of made my own stencil. This is a hand-drawn dot kind of die here, and it creates a really fun background. So I'm going to go in with some of this Ball Gone Blue color. I'll add lots of ink onto my dauber. I can tap off some of the extra color so I don't get any harsh lines. And then I'll start my ink blending here. And you can cover a really good surface area with these too, which is really nice. So I can see my owl through the stencil, and I'm just going to go right around him. You can leave a little bit of a white space between him and some of the blending that you're doing. You can keep it one layer like this and really just add your color behind your little animal. So up there you can see you've added some really fun blending right behind that owl and kind of around it. That adds lots of interest in there. You can kind of finish off your card with blending like that. So you can see this fun owl card that we've created here, but I also colored in these 3 images with those Nuvo alcohol markers too. These are from the same set. Colored them all in with those alcohol markers and did some really fun blending with that. So you can see if you go in with a couple different colors, you can get some really awesome depth and shading with those markers on that Neenah cardstock. Then I went in and used that same die to blend my background, and you can get a really cool look with that. So that really adds lots of depth and dimension using those jumbo daubers in the background. So thank you for joining me in this lesson, and I hope you learned all about how to choose the right paper for the types of mediums that you're using, and how the papers will react to those mediums and give you some really awesome effects. I cannot wait to see your guys' projects in the gallery. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video and want to see more from Scrapbook.com, please like, share, subscribe, and leave a message. Happy crafting!